Hi, my name's Matt, and I'd like to welcome you to this Zinniac video on service mindset for service consumption. This is part of the CoCreate Value step of this customer journey and part of our ITIL specialist course on Drive Stakeholder Value. As we've seen before, services are a means of value co-creation. So in order to co-create value, both the service provider but also the service consumer need to partake. They need to be actively involved. Value can't simply be delivered by the service provider. If services are being used by users, their competencies, attitudes and cultures enable them to become important agents of value co-creation. So how the users use the service will affect how much value the service consumer organization is able to realize from the service. It's therefore important to ensure that a service mindset is shared by all individuals involved in service consumption, not only by the service providers' teams. So it's really having that, the other side of the service mindset, that I as a service consumer understand how to consume services, what is reasonable, what is unreasonable, what is how I should interact with the service provider, and how my interactions will affect the service being provided. One of the things I try to do when I receive a service, whether it's in a coffee shop or if I'm buying something in a retail store or I'm in a restaurant or whatever, is always to look at the person who's providing the service. I'm amazed when I look at other people who are receiving services, particularly in the modern world recently, the number of people who don't look, they're like on their phone. They're like, can I buy that? And yeah, there you go, there's the money. And they're not looking at the person. I always make a conscious effort to make sure I look at the person when I'm asking them for whatever service, and that I might sometimes you need to be doing other things. I quite often pay. Well, I do. I pay with my phone or my watch. Typically, I don't use other methods. I use Apple Pay, so I may well need to look elsewhere when I'm actually paying. But again, once the transaction's completed, I always look the person in the eye and thank them. And I think that's really important. I mean, you may or may not ever see them again, but I feel that that helps with the provision of service. If you're getting that direct human interaction, that direct human contact with the person providing the service, you are likely to get a much better service. And that's part of the service mindset really for service consumption, is that service empathy. We've talked about service empathy from the service provider point of view, but what about service empathy from the consumer point of view? Do you as a consumer have service empathy with the provider? Can you empathize with how they feel? And as before, the guiding principles should guide everything we do. So we're going to look at the guiding principles in relationship to the service mindset for consumption, starting with focusing on value. And again, I'm not going to read all them out. You've got the slides there. You've got copies of the slides. You can read the table yourself, but I'll just pick out ones that I think are key. So with focus on value, are there contradictory stakeholder requirements? And that might be an individual stakeholder having contradictory requirements, or obviously stakeholder A having a contradictory requirement to stakeholder B. A very simple example might be in a restaurant. I order my food. I have a requirement that the food, after I've ordered it, it comes for me to eat quite quickly. That's one requirement. But also, I'd like it cooked fresh. Now, I might order something that to cook it fresh from scratch might take 20 minutes. But that's not quick. But if I want it quick, then they have to pre-cook it and then they're just heating it up and then it's not cooked fresh. So there's a dynamic between those two requirements, and we need to work out a balance. And generally in restaurants, obviously do a lot of preparation, so they try and do lots of preparation so that the cooking time is reduced. So they've done all the preparation and then there's just the cooking time. But we need to think about that in terms of the services we provide. Are there contradictory requirements? And if there are, then talk them through with the consumer and look at the priorities and find where the balance is for individual consumers. Start where you are. What should be retained from the current and previous practices and relationships where the service is being developed and or improved? Yeah, so obviously start where you are. What can we keep? What's good? We don't want to throw everything away unless that's the best thing to do. So is there anything that we can keep? Is there anything we can learn from previous services? And sometimes it might be that something that appears really quite simple can be quite difficult to provide. I was in a situation with a system for a police force where my organisation was the existing service provider of a system for a police force, and they were moving away to it. They were moving to a different provider, so we were just providing legacy support until they moved to the new system. And initially they signed a contract for 6 months of this support until the new system was in. We'll only need it for 6 months and that'll be fine. So we signed the contract. And after 4 months they came and said, can we extend it by another 6 months? And then 6 months later, can we extend it by another 6 months? In the end, they extended it by 3 years. And the reason was that the new provider had committed to provide all the services we provided. And there was one service which was to do with interacting with the systems in the police cars, and it was just much more difficult than they envisaged, and they didn't have people with the skills, knowledge and experience to do it, and it took them much longer. And that was really something where maybe if they'd been more willing to work with us, they could have come to us and said, well, actually, you know how to do this bit, so can we retain that bit of your system? And I think it would have been much easier for them to retain that bit of our system and kind of have an API with it to their system than write it all from scratch. But they wanted to write it all from scratch. It ended up costing them quite a lot of money. And I think although the money came to us from our customer paying for our support, I think it was the other provider who actually had to pay for it because they missed their go live date. Progress iteratively with feedback. How can feedback to the service provider be provided? And I've talked about this before. So do we provide feedback in the form of surveys, questionnaires? Is it just a selection of users, or is it more of an automated system? We talked about that. Direct measurement is generally better if we can do it rather than asking people. But also just getting more of it. So, as I've said, every interaction just to have a thumbs up or a thumbs down for every interaction is better than taking a selection and asking more questions. Collaborate and promote visibility. Where is the band of visibility? So again, I talked about this from the service provider's point of view in terms of what we need to keep behind the curtain, because we are managing specific costs and risks and the consumer doesn't need to know about them. But from the consumer's point of view, yes, we need to share some information, quite a lot of information potentially with the service provider so they can provide us with the services. But what do they not need to know? What do we need to keep private? What do we want them to not know? So where is that band of visibility? And that's important. And partly some of that might be we don't want to give them unnecessary amounts of information because it might confuse them. We want to keep, keep it simple. Just provide them with the right amount of information. Obviously, what is the right amount? Well, we'll find out, iteratively and incrementally. We'll find out over time. We might need to change and have that flexibility. Think and work holistically. What is the context of service consumption and how does it contribute to the objectives of the organisation? How does it fit into the value stream? So again, talked about this from the service provider's point of view, service consumer's point of view. What's the big picture? How does this service help us achieve our objectives? What are those value drivers, and how does it fit into those value streams? If this service fails, can we still deliver the value stream? How important is that value stream to our business? So we may have resilience, say, within the service, but we may need more business resilience outside. So if the service fails, we need more business resilience. So it's, to some extent, that is risk management. It's having that risk management mindset as well to help with that. Keep it simple and practical. I mentioned this just now, but what are the best ways to use the service? So again, there may be multiple ways to use the service, but what's the best, most efficient, most effective way to use the service to get the maximum value out of it? Is there a better way of doing it than not? And I'm sure you do this again when you receive services. Maybe there's some services where you can book in advance, or you can just turn up on the day and kind of access the service if capacity exists. So maybe like a restaurant, you might book the restaurant in advance, or you might just turn up and kind of go, I'd like a table now. I'd like to eat now. Have you got a table for me? Can you serve me now? What's the best way? And it may vary. So if it's a special meal, you're going out, you're taking maybe a partner or a friend out for a birthday or an anniversary or something, then you're probably going to want to book, because you don't want to risk turning up and not being able to eat. If you're just going out for dinner and there's a wide selection of restaurants, then you might go, actually, let's just see where we can get in. We don't need to book. We're not really sure what time we want to eat, so we'll just turn up when we do and see if we can get in, possibly. But what's the best way to do it? That's what we're talking about. What's the best way to consume the service? And then finally, optimize and automate. Obviously, the same questions for the service role. What can we optimize and what can we automate? But what service actions can be performed as part of service consumption? So this is important. So to give you a specific example, I have a lease car, and it's got a computer in it, and with sat nav and so on, and it can be updated. So the software information in the car can be updated. Now, I could, as the service consumer, take my car to the dealership and have the dealer update the software for me. But in order to do that, I've got to book it into the dealer. I've got to drive it to the dealer. I've potentially got to wait at the dealers while they perform the update, and then I've got to drive it back home. So that's potentially a couple of hours of my life to do a simple software update. Or I could perform that service action as part of service consumption, i.e., providing I can connect my car to my Wi-Fi, I could just do that update myself. So just nip into the car, set it going. When it's done, it's done. So it potentially takes a couple of minutes rather than a couple of hours of my life. So that's much more convenient if I can do it myself. So as service consumers, that's having that maturity and that service mindset from the service consumer's point of view, of not saying, well, you're providing the service, you do everything. What I need to understand is, when is it more convenient for me to do it, so it'll actually be less of my time, or where the costs will be less to me. So I have friends who, like I do, have an accountant, and what they do is they keep all their receipts. So they get a paper receipt and they put it in a bag or something and they keep it. And at the end of the month, or maybe even at the end of the year, they hand over a big pile of receipts to their accountant and say, sort that out. And the accountant sorts it out for them. But that takes their accountant a long time. And of course, their accountant charges them for that. Now, to me, that's just a waste of money, because what I do is I get a paper receipt. I've got an app on my phone. I take a photograph of it. It's sucked into the cloud, into my accounting system. I screw the receipt up and throw it away because I've got the copy in the cloud. It's all done. And it's a matter of seconds. And because I do it for every receipt when I receive it, it's just, it's virtually nothing. It's no overhead to me at all. And I save the money of potentially a day of an accountant's time that my friend's paying for the accountant to do that after the fact. And when they're kind of going, well, what was this for? Is this legitimacy? I don't know. And there's lots of interaction. So they sort it out as best they can, but they can't do it on their own anyway. So again, look at what service actions as a consumer can we perform. That's an important thing to look at. Right, so that brings us to the end of this video on service mindset for service consumption. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. Please join me in the next video. Until you see me again, have a great day.